It's been said over and over, especially the last couple of years. Parents are the last line of defense when it comes to the welfare of their children. Whether it's wearing a mask, getting a vaccine, what they learn in schools, or what schools their kids go to. Parents know best and should be trusted to make the best decision as to what's best for their children. Unless it comes to children who are part of the LGBTQ+ community. Then it's our elected leaders who seem to know best. From what books or bathrooms are made available to how someone identifies, the pronouns they use. This afternoon at a speaking event at the State House, the Idaho Freedom Foundation presented their best case for parents and families' decisions being limited in Idaho. Chloe Cole is an 18-year-old woman who regrets going through the transition to be a boy. Growing up in Northern California's Central Valley, she says she realized at an early age she didn't quite feel like she fit in as a girl and began exploring the idea of transitioning at age 12. She told her friends and eventually her parents, who sought out the help of a therapist who affirmed Chloe's identity. She says she started on puberty blockers at age 13, had a mastectomy, a double mastectomy at 15. Chloe says her journey into gender dysphoria was encouraged by what she saw online. And she was told by her therapist and doctors the only way to treat dysphoria was to transition.
My parents, and especially my dad, initially objected to this. And they wanted me to wait until I was 18 and responsible for myself to make the decision. But their hand was forced by the doctors. They were told that there really wasn't any other option. None other had been presented to them. And they said that there was less than a 1% to 2% regret rate, that it was clinically insignificant. And if I were not affirmed in my identity, they said I would be at risk of suicide. I found out that I was being lied to, not only by my doctors, but also by this community of people who I thought were like me and supported me. And that there are many more people in my situation.
Many more people would be relative, while actual numbers of how many people have undergone gender reaffirming procedures or processes aren't known, because there isn't a reporting requirement other than those who use insurance to pay for it. What is known is the number of those who have who regret their gender affirming surgery. They know that's less than 1%. For example, the National Institute of Health compiled 27 studies and found out of the nearly 8,000 patients in those studies who did have gender affirming surgeries, both male and female, 77 had regrets. Chloe says by the age of 16, a year after her surgery, she began to doubt her and her family's decision. So she stopped taking testosterone at 16. And within the next year and a half, she has become the face of stopping transgender surgeries for minors, which is why the IFF paid her to stop in Idaho this week.
Gender dysphoria really is a mental health condition. And yet we're treating it with surgeries and physical interventions. There is not a single other mental health condition that we do the same with. And yet it's perfectly fine for children who wrongly feel that they're the opposite sex to be mutilated and castrated.
Chloe says she blames her doctors for pushing this treatment and not acknowledging her regret when she tried to tell them about it. She said her parents agreed to this procedure only under duress, which is why last fall she filed an intent to sue claim against her doctors and the medical companies that allowed it to happen. Okay, so the basis of this assembly was built on the back of a bill which was introduced this week in the House Judiciary Rules and Administration Committee. On Tuesday, the chairman of that committee, Republican Representative Bruce Skog, brought forth, once again, his Vulnerable Child Protective Act. Representative Skog wants to make it a felony for anyone to give puberty blockers, hormone therapy, or perform gender reassignment surgery to anyone under 18 who is, as he wrote it, struggling with gender dysphoria. With House Bill 71, he's amending an existing law against female genital mutilation that was passed back in 2019 to include these transgender treatments and to include male genitalia. Last year, when he tried it, it included a life sentence in prison for those that violated it. Even with that extreme enforcement, it did pass the House, but it died in the Senate. This time around, he reduced the punishment to 10 years in prison.
I will say children in Idaho are suffering from these procedures, so-called therapies, and having healthy body parts removed. Sometimes that involves a girl of 15 having double mastectomies for sex change purposes.
However, Representative Skog can't prove that Idaho children are, quote, suffering from these procedures because he hasn't brought any forward, probably because there isn't any reporting requirement for such treatment. So Representative Skog has no idea how many transgender teenagers are in Idaho or are getting such treatment, which is probably why they had to bring in somebody from California to make their case. And why Representative Chris Mathias, who voted yes on this bill, by the way, said this during Tuesday's committee hearing.
I know that when we talk about this, the magnitude of the perceived problem is presented as if what we are talking about is quite common. I think, to use your words, Mr. Chairman, a lot of teens are harmed by this. Unlike last year, this year, I would really like to hear from an Idahoan who has had this happen and regrets it and would be or would have been a beneficiary of this law had it been in place. Last year, we only heard from people out of state. I want to hear from someone who lives here, has lived here, and plans on living here to hear how this would impact them.
And that's a great point. So where might there be someone who lives here, has lived here, and plans on living here that we could ask how this might impact them? Okay, so see the gentleman sitting in the front row of that committee meeting, shaking his head while Representative Skog says children of Idaho are suffering from this? Well, we heard from him.
The fact that my child is trans is probably one of the least interesting things about her when you get to know her. You know, she's a pretty amazing person.
That is Preston Thompson and his transgender teenage daughter, Lynn. Their family, in fact, lives here in Idaho and would certainly be impacted by any legislation regulating gender-affirming care. That's because Lynn is on puberty blockers and hormones right now, has been for years. But the Vulnerable Child Protection Act would stop that unless her parents would, want to be felons for supplying this type of treatment. This pending Idaho legislation has pinned them under this fear for 2 years now. They sat down this morning with Andrew Bartline.
Of people who have showed up today.
It's been a year. Specifically for Lynn Thompson, it's been a good year.
That's made me happier. That's been a good thing for me, and my legal name change was a very good thing.
That's one of several changes in Lynn's life. She's a 16-year-old transgender girl.
Her safety is our top concern.
With the full support of her father, Preston.
Like, we've known since Lynn was about 6. I think I mentioned that last time that we talked.
Like, how would you know that? For me, I could always sort of feel like I didn't really get bad gender dysphoria until like puberty started happening, and then it just kept getting worse. But like, when I was a little kid, I was like, huh. Like, about being a guy, and I always identified more with and like felt more like a girl, but like I just didn't have the language or like means to express what I meant by that.
A large part of that expression today is puberty blockers and estrogen hormones. No surgeries right now.
There's a term called gender euphoria, as the exact opposite of gender dysphoria in the trans community. That happens when you finally like look in the mirror and see like yourself.
Do you see yourself?
Yes, a lot more than I used to.
It's still been remarkable to see how much better she's been feeling, knowing that things are, or were at least on pause for a year, that we didn't have to worry about this for a year.
A year. The last time Idaho lawmakers considered banning gender affirmation care for people under 18 years old. That includes the hormones, the puberty blockers, and surgery.
Process of puberty.
And it's come up again this year.
I will say
under the same lawmaker,
children in Idaho are suffering from these procedures, so-called therapies.
Idaho Republican Representative Bruce Skog.
Yeah, I would be very depressed at best.
Would literally turn my wife and I into felons.
A felony for what he says is listening to his child and approaching a long conversation about the best steps forward for their family.
I don't know any parent or, and very few even trans kids who are trying to jump to a surgical intervention route. We did not have pressure from the medical community at all. And if somebody was pushing that on her, that's deplorable. That's not something that should happen. I can tell you that here in Idaho, the clinic that we work with Lynn, the pediatrician that we've worked with, there has been respect and there has been a lot more listening than talking.
Is that a reality? Did you experience anything like that?
I did not experience anything encouraging me to be trans. Like, it just really sucks how people have been portraying it as like they've been groomed into this.
No, This is Lynn's choice.
It's not like kids are just being thrown on the bandwagon.
This is her family's choice.
The fact that my child is trans is probably one of the least interesting things about her when you get to know her. You know, she's a pretty amazing person.
And it's been years.
Feeling true happiness for like the first time.
But recently, it's been a year.
I don't want to worry about bills forcing me to leave my state, and I'm not prepared for what happens after that.
And we talked with Preston Thompson, Lynn's father. Something that really upset him is being told what he can and can't do as a father. He said that, you know, it's an individual case-by-case situation for every family, and it's been a long, drawn-out conversation, Brian. These things don't happen overnight. Now, when we talked with Lynn about what that process has looked like, she went and talked to a doctor, talked to a therapist, went through a bunch of different avenues, and I think it was about a year after she came out to her family until there was any sort of blockers or any sort of hormone treatments, you could say.
Right. And I would be safe in saying we've talked to a couple of transgender teenagers, adults, about how this idea of performing a gender-affirming surgery under the age of 18, I don't know how prevalent that is. And I know that we don't know how prevalent that is, but even talking to members of this community, it doesn't seem like it is.
Yeah, and in Lynn's situation, and from the situation that it sounds that her father's privy to and their peers, that's not something they're looking to do right now, but they're also upset that they don't think it's something that the government should be telling them what they can and can't do right now. Again, that's their perspective, and that's what they're looking at right now.
Which seems to be kind of a trend here in Idaho lately. Thank you very much, Andrew. So this anti-transgender for minors legislation isn't just limited to Idaho by any stretch. All you gotta do is take a look around the country and see how many laws have been passed in the past 2 years or so that have made life more difficult for the LGBTQ community. And now, thanks to 2 Idaho senators, that legislation has gone federal. Senators Jim Risch and Mike Crapo are proud to announce they have joined in co-sponsoring the Parental Rights Over the Education and Care of Their Kids Act. Say it with me. P for parental, R is for rights. Okay, we got that. O is for the over. We're highlighting the in acronyms now, apparently. E is for education, but don't worry about the and in that one. And then C, we go to care, now of. Okay, throw that away. T, wrapping up the protect part for there, and then just add Kids Act at the end. There it is. That makes sense. Anyway, they want to prevent schools from concealing information about students' gender from their parents. The Protect Kids Act would restrict federal funding from any elementary or middle school that allows students to change their pronouns, their gender markers, or sex-based accommodations like locker rooms or bathrooms without the consent of their parents. Crapo says it will make it possible for parents to be actively engaged in their child's education, he says. Risch adds, schools shouldn't promote harmful ideologies. We asked both senators to speak with us about the who, the what, the why of this bill, with no response. But you can bet this is all based on the proposed transgender policy that got a lot of attention in the Caldwell School District and is already in place in several school districts in Idaho. A small section in that policy about confidentiality and how school personnel should use the student's legal name and pronoun assigned at birth when talking to parents, unless it was decided otherwise with said parents. The question is, do they really think that this is done for the sake of deception? Or, as Senators Risch and Crapo believe, this is done because many schools are pushing a particular agenda and want to undermine the rights and authority of parents? Maybe that confidentiality clause is part of the policy because, as you heard Chloe say, she came out to her friends before she came out to her parents. And maybe there's something to be said for a student having a safe space that may not be in their home. Because maybe their parents believe their child's sexuality or gender is, quote, a harmful ideology. This bill was introduced the same day Senator Chris Trakel put out an editorial about the Caldwell School District policy, the same senator that was part of the disruption that shut down last month's school board meeting in Caldwell. He said, I cannot condone the passing of policies that accommodate a small population at the expense of the majority. Yet he and his colleagues are okay with passing a law that only applies to a very small population, those that regret a gender transition, at the expense of the majority, those who are very comfortable and happy with it.